What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JAR. JAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy
Review. It's our weekly show where we go over the magic stories as they're posted on Wizards' website. This week we have The Race Part 1, once again by the R&D narrative team. My quick review at the beginning is, I thought this story was okay. I thought it was a good culmination. It definitely was not the best one from Ixalan. That would be last week's. But yeah, my quick review is that it was good. If you've been following along with Ixalan's story, this is a must-read, basically, because it kind of draws together the last couple of weeks of stories and kind of really all the stories and like leads you into what's to come. So that's my quick review.
Mine is, it's not skippable because, yes, I agree that in order to follow the story, you do need this one. But I wouldn't say it's likable. I think there was a lot of important information, maybe, or leading you in the direction of making you able to receive important information come the next story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was important for the scheme of things, but I wouldn't say I liked it.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So, given that information, do with it what you will. We review, we do not summarize, so if you don't want to be spoiled and you want to take it in for yourself and then give us your own opinions on it, please go ahead and do that, read the story, and then come back here. If you feel based on what Amy said that you don't necessarily want to and you can just listen to what we talk about, that's fine. But once again, if we don't touch on something, that's why we're not actually summarizing, we're just reviewing it. So
I said not skippable. So.
That's true, you did say that. You're right. You just weren't thrilled about it.
But I mean, my personal suggestion is that you always read the story first. That's just
fair.
how I feel about it. But
on to the full review itself. What I will say is this story, kind of based on the way that it was written, it had its focus split on purpose between a bunch of different characters.
It was very split.
Yes.
I didn't like how split it was.
I think it's kind of a trope, and we've talked about this before about like tropes in storytelling and fantasy and whatever, that you have a bunch of individual players that are with their own groups or whatever, who then all come together at one point, at the culmination, at the climax of the story, to kind of solve their issues and approach the goal, which in this case is the Golden City. This story is called The Race, and it is part 1, and that's good because there really wasn't much of a race here. You kind of saw it with like Jason Veraska maybe, and Watley and Tashana a little, but it was not much of a race.
I think it was just signifying the start of the race.
Correct. Which Jace partially kind of alludes to, but we'll get back to that later because that was a whole different thing. But it was interesting because usually these are the types of stories that I would say stereotypically fans enjoy the most, because you get to see all of these characters that you've grown to love, presumably, or that you've at least met, and now you get to see them all interacting with one another. And usually that's your payoff. You've learned about them individually, and now you get to see them interact with a different character. For example, that the Tashana Watley moment should have been amazing. Like that should be like a, yes, that's so cool. Or like a comedic moment of like, oh man, these two working together. But because the first Watley story that we read was very subpar, I didn't feel that. I was just like, oh, okay, Watley's going to work with Tashana now.
And I think for their interaction, I think there was a lot of trying to make it funny. And I feel like you got part of the way there.
Yep.
I feel like each funny statement that was made, I slightly chuckled at instead of actually laughing. And I think because of that, it kind of, I don't know. It was not, I won't say it was subpar like the other one, but it was basic.
It didn't quite hit the mark. And I agree with that.
It was sort of a meatless skeleton of a good story.
Yeah, and of course it was 1/3 or 1/4 of this story, but you then had all the other moments. You had Jace's story, Vona's story, Mavrin Fane's story, or the story focused on Mavrin Fane, and it was. They all kind of were disjointed and didn't really come together.
Yeah.
What I'll say is maybe next week with part 2, hopefully those things will come together.
Kind of see that culmination happen a little bit more.
Because otherwise this was not much of a cohesive story by any means.
Right.
It was what could have been 4 separate, very short, but 4 separate stories on their own. And
what I will say is I think if it had been maybe a visual media sort of a thing, I think it might have been a little easier to follow and maybe as a result a little bit more interesting. But I think because it was a written format, I think it just felt a little bit more segmented than it would have if we were like watching it in a video kind of I don't know.
well, because what I'll also say is, I mean, for me personally, before Ixalan Stories, we had the Commander Magic Story podcasts. And we reviewed those as well. You can go back and watch them. But spoiler alert, on the whole, they were not good. They were not worth your time, my time, her time, anybody's. I don't want to say anybody's time. On the whole, they were not good. There were good moments here and there, and we talked about those. And so, like I said, I encourage you to go watch those videos of ours if you are interested in hearing more about it, if you weren't around for that part. But what I will say is, if this story was 4 separate stories, there were 4 separate podcasts. Just put them instead. Instead of having this long, drawn-out, 4-section story that had very little to do with one another, instead make that separate stories and give us more information.
Okay,
Give
so
us
make each podcast its own backstory of these characters kind of a thing.
No, I mean give us an actual story. Like this one story, break it up into 4 stories.
Yeah, but you couldn't.
But give us more information at the front end. Do what you did with Vona's story. With Vona in this one, you got a little bit of Vona telling her backstory, but it was very brief. And then it was, oh, by the way, the Brazen Coalition ship is right there. Hey, why are we in choppy waters? I'm on the beach. Give us more information on Vona. Give us backstory. This is the first story that depicted or gave you any information on the vampires at all.
Yeah.
And it was the story that was broken up with Jace and Watley again as well. I think, even if it's not 4 separate stories, even if it's 2, give us a vampire story and a Vraska, Jace, and then Watley, Tashana story. I think that would have been better if, instead of trying to force in the Commander story podcasts. That's me personally. It sounds like you don't necessarily fully agree with me, but
No.
okay, you're allowed. I mean, I'd love to hear your input. It's just a suggestion.
It doesn't make sense to break it up that much when you can't have the stories that we've had before it. And you can't do that if it takes the place of the
No, I'm not.
podcast.
No, I'm saying push everything back then. So the first story still would have been, Jace alone, and it would have been when the first podcast was, and you go from there. Just have this portion be those 4 stories that are broken up from here. Regardless, it's just a suggestion. I'm not trying to get into a whole thing with it. It's fine. It was just an idea.
Yeah, Watley's story would have translated decently into that because Watley's story had a lot of repetitive BS in it. So they could have trimmed that down nicely and made it sort of a short story.
Mm-hmm.
And just had short stories instead of podcasts.
And shorter stories are not bad, right?
Yeah, but the problem is Jace alone and the whole Jason Veraska stories aren't really trimmed downable.
No, but I'm also not calling for that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but no, I don't necessarily think that they would need to be. But
I do.
Regardless, that is not
You're
really
saying the story wasn't cohesive. Doing it that way is not cohesive either.
Yeah. Like I said, that's not really what we're here to do, so apologies. In this story, we started off with Adanto. We started off with Adanto, the first fort. We started off with Mavrin Fane showing up, and we get a little bit more information on blood fasting. And we get to see Mavrin Fane. He is kind of voracious in his hunger, and he's going to end the blood fast with a criminal. They put him in jail after he tries to climb the wall and bite at one of the humans' necks, and fails because there's metal, guarding him or whatever. He gets thrown in a cell next to a human who is a criminal, and they say you can feed off of him. One of the priests says, I'll perform the ritual tonight, and you can feed either tonight or tomorrow morning, whatever it was. And we got to learn more about the blood fast, which was a nice introduction because it then led into Vona's story. So we kind of get reminded, right, of the blood fast and that they've sworn only to feed on criminals or the guilty or the sinful, and reminded us that, of course, they are seeking the Golden City, the immortal sun, to try and never have to feed on the blood of the living again, so they can truly be immortal, as I believe as was said in Vona's portion of the story. But then we find out that Vona, the butcher of Magon, I don't exactly know, but there you go, that she is against the concept of the blood fast. And she says, who would want that? Why would you want that? And yet is keeping it a secret because she's aware that the other vampires believe in it, and so she doesn't want to reveal to them that she doesn't care. She'll feast on anybody that gets in her way and whatever. I thought that was kind of the most interesting part of both of those stories, Mavrin Fane's and hers, was the fact that she is kind of a dissenter to that idea, because we were led to believe, at least in the beginning, that was just an across-the-board thing, that all of them believed it. It's not hard to believe that someone would be against it.
What is an across-the-board thing?
Right.
There is no across-the-board thing.
Correct. I'm as a person, I am not someone who appreciates blanket statements, no matter no matter where they're coming from, and so that in and of itself should have kind of clued me in. But I was still like a little bit like, oh, that's cool. It struck me, and I appreciated it. I liked that. I don't know what you, was it typical? Was it expected? Okay. Like I said, it got me. I guess Amy was already there. But that was, besides then, like I said, that was the backstory for Vona that we were given. And then the next thing you know, Vona's like, hey, there's a Brazen Coalition ship. Oh no, we're crashing. Oh, I'm on the beach. I'm going to drink the blood of a pirate and then run off into the woods and come find me. She doesn't say come find me, but that's really what it is, right? She goes and runs off into the woods, and then the next two portions of the story are, oh, one of the vampires is running off into the woods. We have to go find her later. We're going to go do this thing now, which again is part of that race. They're all going to try to find the immortal sun, the Golden City, Araska, whatever you want to call it. And she was kind of, at least in the stories, the first one to head in that direction, if you don't count Kumena, who wasn't part of this story, but who went after knocking out Tishana after she cast her spells, etc. Which, I don't know. I don't know how I feel. I really, like, I thought, I'm looking at you, because I'm curious what you thought. I thought it was okay. Like, it kind of was just like, they're all racing forward at the same time, but they all know that Vona's going, but Vona doesn't know that anyone's necessarily following her. It seemed, like we said, it seemed kind of disjointed and weird. Yeah. So, but that was really what I took out of the Maverin Fane / Adanto portion and the Vona portion. Then we get into more of Jason Veraska, and I feel like the narrative team here gave a lot more time to Jason Veraska and Tishana and Watley, which makes sense but doesn't. Because you've already given Jace 2 prior stories. You've given Veraska like 1.5 prior stories or 2 prior stories. Maybe you've given Jace 3 prior stories, but regardless. And you've given Watley a prior story. So now you have them again, and because you've built them up in this way, and their story has been built up in this way, they were given more time in this one as well, despite the fact that Maverin Fane and Vona, who are named characters in the set, they have their own cards as well. Vona is a mythic. They are kind of, their stories are much, much shorter in comparison to the Planeswalkers, despite the fact that this was supposed to be the solution, and by this I mean the splitting up of the Gatewatch and throwing them to different planes, was supposed to be the solution to nothing but the Gatewatch.
I disagree.
Okay, sure, please.
I think not enough time in this story was given to Jason Veraska, because I think the things that they told us were unlike the stories that we actually really enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
They were just told to us. They weren't shown to us. It wasn't enough of a story. It was just, oh, well, here are the few quick important things that we need to talk about with these two, and we'll just throw it into this story. You know, with Watley
and Tishana.
Yeah, I think that was drawn out and interesting and kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they deserved that. I think that they needed that, so that you could kind of see these two enemies take the bridge that they needed to take together to get to the point that they are at the start of the next story.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
But Vona, I kind of just want to say she's much more of a static character. Ugh, maybe you guys all hate me for saying that, but I think she just doesn't have that much to her yet.
Yeah.
I think we're going to come to learn that she might end up having a change of heart and realizing that, you know, she actually kind of doesn't want to be that same way anymore, or maybe she really just will stay a static character. But to me, she's just a static character. She doesn't have this evolutionary thing that happens with her character, and so because of that, she doesn't need as much time. And it would be unfair to use up that time with her, because her character's not gonna actually improve.
Mm-hmm.
And if she is, then it's not going to be in this story, it's not gonna be in the next story, it'll be a few stories down, or you know, way in the future,
yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, because I kind of envisioned her, now that they've brought her up in this way, I kind of envision her as a big obstacle that's going to be placed in the way of Tishana and Watley, Jason, Veraska. Like, Vona is going to possibly get there first, and then between Vona and Kumena being kind of the two that are counter to what everybody else wants, they are going to be the ones that the Planeswalkers, if you will, have to deal with before they can reach their
Alright,
ultimate goal.
so-
That's my thought. I obviously
Alright,
don't
so
know
we
that.
can think of them as sort of the antagonists of the story.
Right.
But when we do, we still realize, okay, the two antagonists of the story are pretty static characters.
Yes, and of course we still have, they very, very briefly mentioned him in this story, but we also technically have the wild card of Angrath. Because
Yes.
we heard that he's there, Jace sensed a Minotaur, and we heard that he's there, but we don't know whose
His
side he will be on, why
Yeah.
he's there. All we know, but we did see that he is very willing to join up with anyone who is a planeswalker, right? We saw that with Watley. He
Yeah.
like vehemently tried to kill her, and then was just like, "Wait, you're a planeswalker?
Yeah,
Come,
he
I'll
just-
help you."
He just wants to get off this plane
Yes.
so badly
Yes.
that I think, honestly, I think what we might go on to learn his motivations are just that. And whatever his motivations were before no longer matter as long as he can get off this plane.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, which I don't blame him for.
Kind of sucks because I feel like there could have been a lot more to his story.
If he gets
then
off,
maybe that will allow.
well, I was gonna say, if he gets off this plane, maybe he can. Maybe we will see more of him afterwards because of it.
Maybe. We'll
And
see.
I'm-
We'll figure it out.
I'm sorry to keep jumping back and forth. I actually wanted to respond to your comments about Jason Vraska, and you were saying that their portion of the story you felt like could have used more time because
Yeah, it was a little forced, a little basic, a little, bullet points of facts instead of like an actual story.
So the reason that I was saying that I thought that their story could have been shortened and that they've been given many stories is because for whatever reason it is like a plague of the Ixalan stories. This story did more repetition. It talked about the useless island again. It talked about there was almost word for word dialogue from the last story in this story for Jason Vraska's section. Vraska says, "By the way, I again want to thank you for listening to me, for what you said about my story." And Jace says, "It's a story worth sharing." And she says, "Well, thank you so much." And he says, or she says, "Thank you for listening and thank you for what you said. It was very kind." And he says, "Thank you for telling me that story." Go watch last week's video.
Yeah,
we
technically all
blatantly
that
talked
stuff was
about
in
that.
there.
We
Yep.
blatantly talked about that last week. What was the purpose of it? By the way, remember that thing that just happened last week when you read the story? I'm going to reiterate it word for word again and not expand on it in any way.
I think the reason why they're doing that is to remind us of the things that are going to come to be important. So it's kind of like highlighting your notes.
Except-
so you have your notes from last week and now you're just reading them over and highlighting the important facts out of it.
Right. It's just,
It's
there was
boring.
no.
It's not a story.
Yeah, there's no way it was necessary because this story, one thing that I thought was nice about this story was you kind of foresaw things, right? When Vona mentioned, "Oh, there's a Brazen Coalition ship ahead. It says the Belligerent on it. And now a wave just hit the side of my ship." I looked at Amy and I was like, "Oh, guess where we are now?" Because we knew that meant they were at the moment where Tishana was casting her River's Rebuke spell, the third story spotlight or whatever it is. That didn't need to be retold to me. Vona didn't have to say, "I now see a merfolk standing on the shore, waving her arms in the air."
Right.
I don't need to know that. I've already read it. I know it already. But they didn't tell that to us, I'll say. They just kind of let us glimpse it, right? They talked around it and let us come to that conclusion ourselves. And then they were like, "By the way, remember last story? Here's a quote from last story in this one, but it's not in a flashback. I'm just saying it again for no reason."
So it's weird.
It's problematic. It's definitely a problem, and especially because
They needed to choose which way they were going to go with it. And honestly, the first way is the only acceptable way. But either way, you need to pick a way.
Yeah.
And they didn't pick a way. They did both the ways, even though
and
it's unnecessary.
and yet, we've
Now I'm as repetitive as the stories.
but we've seen it before. right? We saw this with Watley's story. Amy mentioned it earlier that it was repetitive. Again, you can go back and watch that video. We talked about it there as well, that almost line for line there was repetition towards the end of the
Right.
story. It was just
Like, oh, here's an important line that you guys need to remember. So we'll say it to you 4 times in one story.
right. And
It's like, okay, we get it.
And the only reason that they may have been doing that, and it's not an excuse and it doesn't give them good reason to do it, but the only reason that they may have been doing it is because we don't see Watley for another 4 stories after
Right.
that. And now that we've seen her in this one, she still hasn't reiterated any of that stuff really. And so the next time it comes up, they may have been repetitious to remind us of that or so that we remember it in the future. But that is not an effective way to do that.
I mean, it technically is.
It's not.
Realistically speaking, if you want to remember something, you read it 3 times and your brain remembers it.
You're right. I'm sorry. That's not. You're right. It is. I guess I used the wrong word. It is an effective way of doing that, but as a standalone story, it is a boring way of doing that. And you just make that one story boring.
Yeah, it might as well just be flashcards.
And for 5 weeks now,
Yeah.
right? We are looking back at that story and saying, what the hell was the point? And maybe in 2 or 3 more weeks, we'll say, oh, that's why it was repetitive. Because we really needed to remember this about Watley. But now those of us who read the story diligently week by week or consume content on it week by week, we are left sitting here for 5 weeks, a month and a half, being like, all right, why was this like this? And now they're just doing it again, right? They're giving that. And I will say, without getting into the serious aspect of how we did last week, the part that they repeated in this week's story was important. Don't get me wrong, but it was given the time last week. And it was as impactful, if not much, much more impactful when they did it last week. And I don't think they needed to do it again, because I think that the seriousness and the heaviness of it in last week's story was enough for me personally to remember it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was not the kind of thing where it's like, well, in a week we're going to forget that happened, so I'm really glad that they did that. No, not that one. Definitely not that one. Other lines from last week's story, maybe. Right?
The thing is, it's not about the lines. It's about the way that story makes you feel.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, because we talked about the ups and downs and the
So to me, that story was a work of art.
Agreed.
The other stories are study material.
Or I was going to say setup. Yeah. And that's
study material.
And that's unfortunate because we can't, at least I personally, maybe you guys differ, maybe you differ. I came into the Ixalan stories looking forward to a continuation of the positive momentum from Amonkhet. And the positive momentum that I saw from Amonkhet was, I walked out of Hour of Devastation as well, but I walked out of Hour of Devastation really caring about the characters from the plane of Amonkhet.
Yeah.
I cared that all of them were going into the desert. I hoped that they would all be okay, that they would all find a place to live. Inti and Tewa, I don't know how to pronounce that name. Teyu is how I've been saying it, but I don't know that that's correct. But Inti and Teyu, who are relatives and warriors alongside Watley, right now I don't care. Like if we never hear about them again, I'll be like, why haven't they talked about them? But at the same time, it just won't.
You just read their names, and their names sounded familiar to me, but I didn't know who you were talking about.
Yes. So that's my point. They did such a good job on Amonkhet of introducing characters to us, even in one story.
Yeah. And making us actually give a damn about them.
Hepatra. How cool was Hepatra's story?
Right.
Alone. Right? We heard from Hepatra for a little bit, and about halfway through that story, I remember Amy and I looked at each other, we were like, she is awesome. Right? We knew it right then and there, and then the next time we saw her, it was like, oh, sweet, it's Hepatra again.
Back.
Yeah. And we cared. We care about them going forward. We care about where they end up, and that'll be the kind of thing where hopefully many, many years down the line, if and when we return to Amonkhet, if we see those characters again, it'll be like, oh, sweet, we get to see them again, as opposed to if we come back, as of right now, if we were to leave and then come back to Ixalan years later and they introduce Inti, it'd be like, who?
Yeah.
Who's Inti again? Who's Teiyu again? I don't remember these people.
Right.
Because it's not...
But, like, I can see that, like, in a few years, if we went back to the plane of Amonkhet, that we would remember who Hepatra was.
Oh, yeah.
Would, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Even if we didn't remember her name exactly, we'd be like, oh, yeah, that awesome lady.
Yeah.
You know? And I would probably remember the picture on her card. Mm-hmm. Because I'm
cool.
kind of more of a visual person
mm-hmm.
in the way I remember things.
Mm-hmm.
These people, who cares? Not me.
Yeah. So, speaking of these people, and to kind of, like, the last couple of things I wanted to mention, first of all, I really appreciated, we've mentioned Alison Lures on the show many, many times. We really enjoy her work. Obviously,
yes.
We are sitting here reviewing these stories, and whether or not she had a hand in this story, we don't know, because it's just collaboratively by the R&D narrative team. But regardless, she tweeted today, there was a string of questions that Jace asked about Veraska, which was really the, like, I'm in love with her and I want to know everything about her, just tell me every little thing, right?
Well, and he was asked, the questions that came to his mind were half, like, I'm on a first date with this person
Yep.
questions, and the other half were really questions about, okay, what about these, like, big important things?
Yes.
That we have in common.
She just dropped a
So it's
planeswalking bombshell on
right,
me.
so it's
I
like-
want to know more.
Right, so it's like, okay, we have these things in common, they're really important. But so, like, those questions were almost partially also about himself,
Mm-hmm.
which makes total sense. He has amnesia, you know.
And he's an inquisitive guy by
Exactly,
nature,
exactly.
whether he remembers it or not.
Right.
But so I loved Allison's tweet because she tweeted that Veraska does like books, because Jace asked if she likes books. Jace asked what the area between the planes is made up of. Allison said it's ether, which we basically knew already, but still. And he asked what was the difference between planeswalking and regular magic, and Allison said that it was not everyone can planeswalk, but some people can, you know, basically saying that some people can use magic. And then Jace wanted to know what her favorite dessert was. So like Amy said, the two middle questions were about planeswalking and magic in general, and the first and the last were about her personally. And what Allison said was that her favorite dessert is turdelnik. Is that what we said it was, how it was pronounced? I apologize if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. We actually looked up the pronunciation because I was trying to remember it.
But it was kind of like hard to...
Turdelnik, I think, is how you pronounce
Yes. I think
It's
so.
Trdelnik. Obviously, I encourage you to go look up
Yeah,
Allison
look it
Lures
up.
on
It's-
It's, Twitter.
it's cool.
But look up it's like
Look
a
up the
rolled
dessert.
Yes, it's like a rolled cake dessert. Which
Yeah.
I guess then thanks go out to Allison because we learned something.
Yeah.
Today. We learned what turdelnik is, and it looks delicious. If I could ever find a place where I would be able to get turdelnik, I would probably go for it.
A Czech or Scandinavian.
Sorry,
Nice.
I should have rephrased. If there's anywhere where I can find turdelnik without having to get on an airplane first, that'd be great. I would, I would definitely try it sometime.
Hey, I'm sure if we go to a big enough city, they will have some sort of a bakery. that
Anything is
may
possible.
or may not have something very similar to or exactly the same as that.
It's possible. The last thing I wanted to mention, problem-wise, and I feel like we complained a lot on this one, but that's kind of the nature of if the story was bad and that's the interaction that we, or if we didn't like the story and that's how we felt about it, that's how we're going to review it. And one of the things that I wrote down specifically because I wanted to bring it up, there were two things. One, and I promised earlier that I would say it, which is why I'm making a point of mentioning it. One was, when Jace's story began, it talked about him being in the water, and he said, oh, thank God I remember how to swim. What? In Jace alone, you were on a raft. Your raft got destroyed by waves and stuff, and you were swimming in the water. or floated in the water at least to get to Useless Island. At least I believe that's what happened. I could be totally wrong, but I'm relatively certain that's what happened. It's been a couple of weeks, but feel free to correct me in the comments down below if you remember differently.
I thought it was the other island.
No, he started on one island
Yeah,
and
but
then
that
made
was
the
Useless
raft.
Island.
No. Useless Island was, oh, I gotcha. He called it, no, I think Useless Island was the one that just was all rocky and had like bird crap all over it, despite the fact that he left from the island that he was bored of. So maybe he called
the
it...
first island was Useless Island, and the second island was even shittier. And I don't think he called it anything.
Right, that's fair. That's totally fair. Again, it's been a couple weeks, so I apologize for not remembering exactly. But again, when he was like, "Oh, thank God I remembered how to swim," I'm like, you were on a raft. You made a raft.
Yeah, I was pissed. I was like, what?
It made no sense.
Because they're not doing a good
Right,
job.
and again, that goes back to our problem that we
did
had.
they read the other stories that were written?
Right, and that goes back to our problem that we had with Jace alone, which was that there were so many things that just made no sense.
Yeah, just inconsistencies and just weird stuff.
And to go along with that, the last thing that like that from this story was when Jace was like, he said that he felt like he was at the starting gate of a race and that they were about to let the rabbit loose and he was going to chase after it. He just talked about how he was happy that he remembered how to swim, but he remembers the complexities of a starting gate and how a race like that starts. I was like, I wrote it down because it made less than no sense.
Yeah.
I was just floored. And it kind of took me out for a little bit, but the rest of the story brought me back in because then we got to Watley and Tashana, and that was a little bit more interesting as well. But that was how the Jace story started.
Yeah, it was stupid.
And I was not interested in continuing. I did, clearly.
I was pissed.
Yes, it was very frustrating because the repetition, like from Watley's story, and the incongruity of Jace's story and his amnesia were both depicted in this one, which was already pretty fragmented to start with.
Right.
So it didn't need any help being like something that kind of took us out of it and like going like, wait, what just happened? What's going on? So that was a little upsetting. Overall, I think that I'm hopeful for next week because I think that next week has the potential to be a little bit more action-packed, whereas as we said, it feels like this week was much more of a setup week to lead us into a confrontation next week, which I'm looking forward to, like I said, because I think that that'll be the way to breathe some life into this. I'm hoping, fingers crossed. I think that the concept of Angrath, Vona, and Kumena coming up against Watley, Jace, Veraska, and Tashana. Did I say Tashana twice? No, I did not. So, like, that should be very interesting. And to see if, do Jace and Veraska work with Watley and Tashana? Or is it like a three-way battle or multiple ways? I'm interested to see where that goes. I'm hoping that I'm not disappointed again, because it's been like, kind of some not so good stories, and then last week was an amazing story, and I will never ever take that away from them, even if it's like bad 5 times in a row or not so good 5 times in a row, and then there's a really good one. I will give credit where credit is due, and last week's was a gem, and I'm hoping that they can find another one of those over the next week or over the next couple of weeks. I'm optimistic.
I'm kind of opposite of that. I think that the relationship between Veraska and Jace is interesting, but I think seeing them sort of participate in this race, I'm not going to be too intrigued.
Okay.
The person that I care about seeing how they act in this situation is Tashana.
Fair.
That will be interesting to
Definitely
me.
Fair.
Everyone else, I think, will just be either helping or hindering her, in my mind.
That's fair. Sounds about right. Because she's
yeah.
going to have to confront Kumena, but also Tishana's like, in and of herself, seemingly the only one trying to like keep everyone away from the Golden City, and everybody else is like, well, we're going.
Right.
You know, so yeah, no, you're right. That should be very interesting.
But maybe that comes a little bit from the fact that I'm interested in history and I care a lot about artifacts and the preservation of them and what they meant to the civilizations that created them and
Right.
things like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe if I didn't care about those things, Tishana wouldn't be the character that I gravitated toward. I don't know.
No, that's fair. It's definitely possible.
That's my own quick self-analysis, maybe, of that. I don't know.
Self-diagnosing, maybe. We shall see. I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, hopefully it is. We're not back here next week, kind of having similar discussions, because that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been another episode of JAR here on Geek for All. Thank you for joining us as we showed off our...
Hashtag Vorthos Pride.
I remembered this week. I will say...
I thought you were going to forget. I almost put my fist up just to like remind you.
I will say, when it pops up, we will have our logo popping up on the screen. We'll have videos popping up over my face, other places.
I literally just looked up.
Oh yeah, no, it's right there. Don't you see it?
No,
yeah,
I totally see it.
Okay, great.
It's right on that popter.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it will be. That's where we put it. But regardless, if you click on our logo, you will be able to subscribe to our channel to find out when all of our videos come out. We have these reviews every Thursday. Yes. We have product openings every Monday, and we have drafts every Saturday. Please come out and watch my terrible, terrible drafting.
It will at least be entertaining if you want to laugh.
Yeah. Yeah, feel free to come and yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Feel free to come and correct all my mistakes and etc. And the other videos are here on the screen as well. So, like I said, thank you guys so much for watching. I will say one more time, if you are still here, people have been having some issues with subscriptions on our channel, so please, we've contacted YouTube, but of course they have not contacted us back. We're too small for them to care, but I'll say it here. If you have been subscribed, please check and make sure that you still are, just so that you make sure that you know when these videos are coming out. Right. It helps us out a lot as well. That's all I'll say. Thank you guys once again for watching. Again, on Geek for All, this has been Jar. I've been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.